By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Hat to one, the poacher and the peacock, the mist clung to the surface of the Lochdubh waters like a damp grey blanket that refused to be aired out. It was the sort of morning that suggested the sun had given up on the Scottish Highlands entirely, opting instead for a long lie-in. PC Hamish Macbeth, however, was wide awake, though active would have been an overstatement. He was currently crouched behind a thicket of gorse near the banks of the River Ngurna, his long, lanky frame folded into a shape that suggested a particularly ginger heron. His dog, Lugs, a creature of uncertain lineage, and remarkably hairy ear sat beside him, mirroring his master's intense concentration. Hamish was not officially on duty. Or rather, he was on the sort of duty that involved securing a fresh salmon for his supper before the water bailiff, or worse, a stray tourist, wandered by. In Lochdubh, the law was a flexible thing, much like the rod Hamish held in his calloused hands. To Hamish, the law was designed to keep the peace, and nothing kept the peace quite like a well-fed policeman who didn't have to spend his meagre wages at the overpriced grocery in Ullapool. "Steady, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his soft Highland burr barely audible over the rush of the water. "He's a grand yin, just a wee bit closer." The salmon, a silver streak of pure muscle, hovered in the dark pool. Just as Hamish prepared to make his move, the silence of the glen was shattered by a sound so alien to the Highlands that Lugs let out a low, mournful howl. It was the aggressive thwack crunch of a high-end SUV suspension being murdered by a pothole, followed shortly by the blare of a horn. Hamish sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of a man whose peaceful criminality had been rudely interrupted. "Oh!" He slowly stood up, brushing the damp peat from his trousers. The salmon, sensing the vibration of the heavy vehicle, flicked its tail and vanished into the depths. "Well, that's that then," Hamish muttered to Lugs. "Supper's gone, and trouble's arrived." The source of the commotion was a brand-new metallic gold Land Rover that looked as though it had never seen a speck of dirt in its life until it had reached the Lochdubh backroad. It was currently idling near the old Crofter's gate, a rusted iron relic that marked the entrance to the long-abandoned Macrae estate. Stepping out of the vehicle was a man who looked like he had been curated by a London boutique specifically to annoy the locals. He wore a crisp, quilted Barber jacket that had clearly never felt the sting of a Highland gale, pristine yellow corduroy trousers, and leather boots that cost more than Hamish's annual heating allowance. "You there, local man?" the stranger shouted, waving a manicured hand. Hamish adopted his most vacant expression, the one he reserved for tourists and senior police officers. He tilted his head, let his jaw slacken just a fraction, and moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who found the concept of hurrying to be a foreign philosophy. Hamish asked, leaning against the gate. "Can I be helping you?" "I certainly hope so," the man said, marching over. He smelled of expensive cologne and impatience. "I am Julian Vane. I've purchased the Macrae Croft and the surrounding acreage. I'm turning it into the Highlands sanctuary and exclusive wellness retreat for the creatively exhausted." Hamish looked at the derelict stone cottage up the hill, which currently housed more sheep droppings than wellness. "Is that so?" "It'll be needing a fair bit of wellness itself," thinking. "The roof's been gone since the great gale of '98. Vane gave Hamish a look of supreme condescension. "Money is no object, Mr. Macbeth." Hamish Macbeth. The local constable. Vane's eyebrows shot up. He looked Hamish up and down from the uncombed shock of red hair to the muddy boots, and the dog that looked like a discarded rug. "You're de police?" Good God. I was told this was a remote outpost, but I didn't realize they'd done away with uniforms and basic hygiene. Hamish felt the familiar stirrings of a dry, cold anger, but he kept his voice soft. "It's a quiet village, Mr. Vane. We find that the more we look like the folk we live among, the less they feel the need to break things." "Well, see that you keep the folk away from my gate," Vane snapped. "I've seen some of the locals poaching on my stretch of the river already. Scruffy types. If I catch them, I'll expect you to lock them up. I want this area cleared of vagrants. It interferes with the vibe of the retreat." "The vibe?" Hamish repeated, tasting the word like it was a sour sweet. "The atmosphere of exclusivity. Now, be a good fellow and open this gate. The lock is rusted shut, and I haven't the time to struggle with it." Hamish looked at the lock. He could have broken it with a well-placed kick, or perhaps used the WD-40 he kept in his pocket for his fishing reel. Instead, he pulled out a small tin of tobacco and began to slowly, methodically roll a cigarette. "It's a stubborn yin, that lock," Hamish said, striking a match against the gatepost. "The salt air, you see, it eats the iron. He'll have to be getting the proper tools from the station. Might take a day or two. Maybe 3 if the rain holds." Vane's face turned a shade of purple that matched the heather on the hills. "This is unacceptable. I have contractors arriving this afternoon. I shall be speaking to your superiors in Strathbane." "You do that, sir," Hamish said pleasantly, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Ask for DCI Blair. He's a man who very much enjoys a phone call about gates. He'll likely give it his full and undivided attention." Vane stormed back to his golden chariot, slammed the door, and reversed with such violence that he sent a spray of gravel over lugs. The dog barked once, a sharp, judgmental sound. Hamish watched the Land Rover disappear back toward the village. He knew the type. Vane would spend a fortune, offend everyone from the postmistress to the minister, and then wonder why his pipes froze in the winter and no one came to fix them. "Exclusive wellness," Hamish muttered to lugs. "I'm thinking Mr. Vane is going to find that Lochdubh has its own way of curing people of their nonsense." He looked back at the river. The salmon was gone, and his stomach let out a treacherous growl. He decided to head to the Tummel Castle Hotel. Perhaps if he looked pathetic enough, Mrs. Emma Grant might find it in her heart to give him a leftover scone and a pot of tea in exchange for the latest gossip about the gold-plated Sassenach at the Crofter's gate. He didn't know yet that Julian Vane's plans for a retreat were about to be permanently cancelled. He didn't know that the rusted gate would soon be the centre of a crime scene that would bring the dreaded DCI Blair screaming into Lochdubh. All Hamish knew was that his morning had been ruined, and in the Highlands, a ruined morning was often the herald of a very bloody afternoon. Chapter 2. The body in the heather kitchen of the Tummel Castle Hotel was the true heartbeat of Lochdubh, pulsing with the scent of frying bacon and the sharp, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that hadn't kept the right time since the coronation. Hamish Macbeth sat at the scrubbed pine table, his long legs stretched out toward the range, a heavy mug of coffee cradled in his hands. Mrs. Emma Grant, the hotel's proprietor, was currently engaged in the dual task of beating eggs and dismantling the character of Julian Vane. "A Highland sanctuary," he calls it. Mrs. Grant snorted, her whisk hitting the copper bowl with clinical aggression. As if the Highlands weren't sanctuary enough without some Sassenach in yellow trousers charging £500 a night to teach folk how to breathe. "I've been breathing in Lochdubh for 60 years, Hamish, and I've never needed a brochure to tell me how to do it." "Aye," Hamish murmured, staring longingly at a plate of cooling scones on the counter. "He's a man with more money than sense, I'm thinking. He tried to get me to arrest the entire village for interfering with his vibe this morning. The only thing interfering with his vibe will be the midges," Mrs. Grant said, sliding a scone toward Hamish with a practiced flick of her wrist. "They don't care much for expensive cologne. They find it a lovely seasoning." Hamish had just managed to apply a generous layer of salted butter to the scone when the back door burst open. Archie McLean, a local fisherman whose face resembled a topographical map of the North Sea, stood there panting. His eyes were wide, and his breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. "Hamish!" Archie choked out. "The gate. The Crofter's gate. You've got to come." Hamish paused, the scone halfway to his mouth. He felt a familiar, cold, sinking sensation in his gut. It was the feeling of a peaceful day being dragged behind a barn and shot. "Is it Mr. Vane, Archie? Is he shouting about his lock again?" "He's no shouting," Archie said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "He's no doing much of anything." He's stuck, Hamish, right in the ironwork, and his face... Och, it's no right. Hamish stood up slowly, the scone forgotten. He grabbed his peaked cap from the chair and whistled for Lugs, who had been dreaming of rabbits under the table. "Stay here, Archie. Drink some of Mrs. Grant's tea. I'll go have a look." The drive back to the Macrae estate was a sombre affair. The mist had thickened, turning the landscape into a ghostly blur of charcoal and violet. When Hamish reached the Crofter's gate, he saw the golden Land Rover idling, its engine purring with expensive indifference. The driver's side door was wide open, and the radio was softly playing a piece of minimalist ambient music, the kind of tinkling bells and synthetic drones that Vane likely considered soul-cleansing. Hamish climbed out of his Land Rover and approached the gate. He stopped 10 feet away. Julian Vane was indeed stuck. It appeared the newcomer had returned to the gate with a heavy-duty bolt cutter, determined to force his way into his sanctuary. But the rusted iron of the Macrae gate had held a final, spiteful grudge. Vane's body was twisted in a grotesque fashion. His head was wedged firmly between two of the vertical iron bars, His neck bent at an impossible, sickening angle. His quilted Barber jacket had snagged on a jagged, decorative fleur-de-lis, pinning him to the gate like a butterfly in a display case. But it was the costume that added the touch of the bizarre. Vane had apparently changed since their morning encounter. He was now wearing a long, flowing white linen robe, presumably his wellness attire, which was now splattered with the dark, peaty mud of the Highlands. His feet, encased in expensive silk slippers, dangled inches above the ground. Hamish knelt down, his eyes narrowing. He didn't need a medical degree to see that Vane was dead. The man's eyes were wide, staring at the misty hills with an expression of profound shock, as if he couldn't believe the scenery had dared to kill him. "Well now," Hamish whispered to Luggs. "That's a sorry way to go, strangled by a gate you bought and paid for." Luggs whined and sat back, refusing to get closer. Hamish didn't touch anything. He stood up and began a slow circle of the body, his eyes scanning the mud. The ground was a mess of footprints, Vane's boots, Archie's heavy treads, and his own from earlier. But there was something else. A set of prints that looked like they belonged to a woman's shoe, something delicate, perhaps a heel leading away from the gate and into the thick gorse. He also noticed the bolt cutters. They were lying several feet away, tossed into the heather as if they had been dropped in a hurry. A sharp, cold wind whipped off the loch, tugging at Hamish's red hair. He looked at the dead man, then at the golden car, and finally at the silent, brooding mountains. This wasn't an accident. The bars of the gate were close, yes, but not so close that a man would accidentally wedge his own neck into them with enough force to snap it not, unless he was pushed. Or held. Hamish sighed a long, weary sound that was lost to the wind. He reached for his radio, his heart heavy. "Knocked up to base," he said into the receiver. "This is PC Macbeth. We've got a situation at the old Macquarie gate. It's a death. A suspicious one." He knew what would happen next. Within the hour, the peace of the glen would be shattered by the sirens of the Strathbane CID. DCI Blair would arrive, smelling of cheap cigarettes and resentment, looking for someone to blame so he could get back to the pub. Hamish looked at Vane one last time. "You wanted exclusivity, Mr. Vane," he muttered. "I'm thinking you've found the most exclusive club of all. And you've gone and ruined my supper twice in one day." He sat on the bumper of his Land Rover, pulled out his tobacco tin and began to wait. The Highland sanctuary had claimed its first soul, and Hamish Macbeth knew that before the week was out, he'd be forced to do a lot more than just breathe. Chapter 3. The heavy brigade, the silence of the Highlands, was not merely broken, it was shattered, pulverised, and scattered to the winds by the arrival of the Strathbane CID. The scream of sirens echoed off the surrounding peaks of Ben Bui, sounding like a chorus of banshees with a collective toothache. 3 police cruisers, followed by a nondescript white van, tore up the narrow track to the Crofter's gate, sending plumes of muddy water over the gorse and forcing a disgruntled Luggs to retreat to the safety of Hamish Land Rover. Out of the lead car stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who looked like he had been constructed entirely out of angry sausages squeezed into a cheap, grey suit. His face was a permanent shade of boiled ham pink, and his eyes were small, dark, and perpetually searching for someone to blame for his indigestion. Following him were Detectives Anderson and McLean, 2 men who had spent so much time in Blair's shadow that they had developed a shared aura of weary cynicism. "God's sake, Macbeth," Blair roared, his voice cutting through the mist like a foghorn. "Look at this place. It's a bog. Why is it always a bog when you're involved?" Hamish stood slowly from his seat on the bumper, his face a mask of placid, almost bovine, unconcern. "Good afternoon to you, sir. I'm thinking the weather doesn't much care for our jurisdictional preferences." Blair stumped toward the gate, his polished shoes instantly succumbing to the peaty muck. He let out a string of oaths that would have made the local minister, Mr. Wellington, faint dead away. He came to a halt in front of the gate and stared at the late Julian Vane. "What in the name of the wee free is that?" Blair demanded, pointing a stubby finger at Vane's white linen robe. "Is he a ghost? A cultist? Or did he just get lost on his way to a toga party?" "That would be Mr. Julian Vane, sir," Hamish said softly, tilting his cap back. "The new owner of the Macquarie estate. He was planning a Highland sanctuary for the wealthy. That's his wellness outfit, I believe." "Wellness?" Blair snorted, a sound like a drain backing up. "He looks remarkably unwell to me, Macbeth. He looks like a prize idiot who got his head stuck in a fence. This is an accident. A pathetic, clumsy accident. Case closed. Anderson, get the photographer over here so we can clear this rubbish and get back to civilization. I've got a steak and ale pie waiting for me in Strathbane." Hamish cleared his throat, a small, apologetic sound. "I'm no so sure about the accident part, sir." "Ah." The bars are wide, but most so wide a man could slide his head in and snap his own neck without a fair bit of help. And the bolt cutters, they are a long way from his hands. Blair turned on Hamish, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of plum. "Listen to me, you red-headed turnip. I am the Detective Chief Inspector. You are a village bobby whose greatest professional achievement is finding a lost sheep in a snowstorm. Don't you dare start thinking on my time. It's a dangerous habit for a man of your limited capacity." Hamish dropped his gaze to his boots, looking suitably chastened. Internally, he was noting the way Blair was trampling right over the delicate shoe prints head spotted earlier. "Aye, sir. Y'all be wanting to speak to Archie McLean, then?" He found the body. "McLean?" Blair's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a man who had found an easy target. "The fisherman? The one with the poaching record longer than his fishing line?" "The very same, sir. He's back at the hotel, quite shaken." "Shaken?" "More like he's shaking because he realized he killed the man who was going to stop his illegal salmon trade. It's obvious, Macbeth. Even for you. Vane catches McLean poaching." They struggle. McLean shoves his head into the gate to shut him up. It's robbery and homicide. He'll have a confession out of that old drunk before the sun sets, if the sun ever actually rises in this godforsaken hole. "Archie's a poacher, sir, that's true enough," Hamish said, his voice mild. "But he's no a killer. He hasn't the stomach for it. Besides, there were woman's prints near the woman's prints." Blair laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You've been watching too many of those American shows, Macbeth. Probably just some hiker or a local dairymaid. Not chasing ghosts and skirts when I've got a prime suspect sitting in a hotel bar." Blair turned to his detectives. Anderson, McLean, secure the vehicle. "I want every inch of that golden monstrosity searched. Then we go to the hotel and lift the fisherman. Macbeth, you stay here. Don't touch anything. Don't even breathe on the gate. Just stand there and look. Well, look like you usually do. Like a lamppost with a ginger wig." Hamish watched as the CID team swarmed the scene with all the grace of a herd of startled Highland cattle. They bagged the bolt cutters without checking for prints in the mud. They scuffed the ground where the woman's shoes had pressed into the moss, and they shouted orders at each other that the wind carried away over the loch. As Blair climbed back into his car, he rolled down the window. "And Macbeth, if I hear you've been investigating on your own, he'll have you transferred to a desk in the Glasgow slums so fast your head will spin." "Understood?" "Perfectly, sir," Hamish said, giving a slow, clumsy salute. "He'll just be here, guarding the gate." The sirens started up again as the convoy sped back toward Lochdubh, leaving Hamish and Lugs in the returning silence. The mist was beginning to turn into a fine, needle-like ran the kind that soaked through even the thickest wool. Hamish looked at the body of Julian Vane. The man's white robe was now sodden and grey, clinging to his cooling skin. Blair was wrong, of course. Blair was almost always wrong. Archie McLean might steal a fish, but he wouldn't kill a man by wedging his head into a gate. It was too personal, too symbolic, and required a certain kind of cold, calculated cruelty that Archie lacked. And then there were the shoes. All expensive and definitely not belonging to a dairymaid. Hamish whistled for Lugs. "Well, Lugs," he sighed, pulling his collar up against the rain. "The heavy brigade has arrived to make a mess of things, which means it's time for us to start mooching. I think it'll start with the postmistress. Mrs. Kennedy always knows who's been wearing fancy heels on a muddy track." He looked back at the gate one last time. Blair could have the credit, the headlines, and the steak and ale pie. Hamish just wanted to find out who had turned a Highland sanctuary into a Highland morgue, and more importantly, he wanted to do it quietly enough that he wouldn't be rewarded with a promotion. The game was afoot, but in Lochdubh, the game was usually played over a very slow, very informative cup of tea. Chapter 4, Tea and Treachery, the rain in Lochdubh, had transitioned from a fine mist to a persistent, bone-chilling drizzle that the locals called soft weather, mainly because it softened the resolve of anyone foolish enough to be outside. Hamish Macbeth, however, was safely ensconced within the fragrant, cluttered warmth of the village post office and general store. The air here smelled of paraffin, peppermint humbugs, and the damp wool of elderly cardigans. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, sat behind her brass-grilled counter like a spider in the centre of a very well-informed web. Her spectacles, perched on the end of a sharp, inquisitive nose, gleamed with the reflected light of a single flickering fluorescent bulb. "Terrible business, Hamish," she said, though her tone suggested she found the terrible business to be the most exciting thing to happen since the grocery van lost its brakes on the Bree. "A man found dead in a gate. An Assassinach at that. They really aren't built for our architecture, are they? Hamish leaned against the counter, looking for all the world like a man who had no intention of doing another lick of work until the next century. It's a sad thing, Mrs. Kennedy.
A very sad thing indeed. And poor Archie McLean being hauled off to the station
By DCI Blair. It's a tragedy. Mrs. Kennedy snorted, reaching for a tin of biscuits and pointedly not offering one to Hamish until he looked sufficiently pathetic. Archie couldn't kill a midgie if it sat on his nose and called him names. Blair is a fool. Always was, always will be. He's got the brains of a boiled turnip. Hamish sighed, his stomach giving a timely, mournful growl. I am sure you're right, but Blair's convinced. He says it was a poaching dispute. Unless, of course, there was someone else wandering about the Macri estate. Someone, perhaps not from around here? Mrs. Kennedy paused, her hand hovering over the biscuit tin. She looked at Hamish, her eyes narrowing behind her lenses. She knew Hamish's lazy look. It was the look he wore when he was fishing for more than just salmon. Well, she said, finally sliding a digestive biscuit across the counter. There was that woman. Hamish took the biscuit with a grateful nod. A woman, you say? Not a local woman, I'm thinking. Local? Hamish Macbeth, if any woman in this village wore shoes like that, she'd be in the infirmary with 2 broken ankles before she reached the end of the garden path. Is Tyletosh. I saw her yesterday afternoon stepping out of a silver Mercedes at the hotel. She looked like she'd been poured into her dress and forgot to say when. Hamish chewed slowly, his mind cataloguing the information. Did she have a name, this vision in red? Ah, the register at the hotel says Miss Serena Vane. A cousin, she told Mrs. Grant. But if they are cousins, I am the Queen of Sheba. There was a look in her eye, Hamish. Not the look of a grieving relative. More the look of someone who's been waiting for a bus, and it's finally arrived. Serena Vane, Hamish repeated softly. And she was headed toward the Crofters' gate. She was asking for directions. Said Julian had forgotten his manners and left her at the hotel while he went to check his boundaries. She didn't look happy about it. She looked like she wanted to check his boundaries with a sharp stick. Hamish moved his mooching operation from the post office to the kitchen of the Tommel Castle Hotel. Mrs. Grant, still bristling from Blair's earlier intrusion, welcomed him with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of cold ham. She's in room 4, Mrs. Grant whispered, leaning over the table. Miss Vane. She's been in there since the news broke, distraught, she says. But I went in to bring her a brandy, and she was sitting on the bed, stone-faced, going through a pile of legal papers as thick as a Bible. Didn't look very distraught to me. Looked like an accountant at an audit. Did she now? Hamish sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. And did she happen to mention Julian's finances? Or perhaps his wellness retreat? Mrs. Grant shook her head. Not to me, but I heard her on the phone. The walls in room 4 are thin, ye ken. She was talking to someone named Marcus. She said, and I quote, "The idiot's gone and done it. The estate is mine. Just make sure the papers are ready for the morning." Hamish let out a long, slow whistle. The idiot's gone and done it. That's a strange way to mourn a cousin. She's no his cousin Hamish, Mrs. Grant said firmly. I saw her reflection in the mirror when she thought ID left. She was smiling. A cold, hard smile. It gave me the shivers. Hamish looked out the window. Down the street he could see the lights of the police station where Blair was undoubtedly shouting at Archie McLean. Blair was looking for a motive in a fish, while Hamish was finding one in a Mercedes and a cold, hard smile. Julian Vane hadn't been a beloved figure, but he had been a wealthy one. And wealth in the Highlands was like a magnetit attracted all sorts of steel-edged people. Serena Vane had arrived just in time for Julian to have a fatal encounter with a gate he couldn't open. It was too neat, too convenient. Hamish? Mrs. Grant asked, noticing the way his eyes had gone distant and sharp. Aye, Mrs. Grant. Are ye going to tell Blair about the woman and the phone call? Hamish stood up, brushing the crumbs from his trousers. He looked at Lugs, who was resting his head on his paws, watching his master. If I tell Blair, hell just shout at her. Shell call a lawyer from London, and Archie will stay in a cell while they argue about procedure, Hamish said quietly. No, I think I'll just keep mooching. I'd like to see those red shoes for myself. There's something about a woman who brings stilettos to a bog that tells you everything you need to know about her character. He thanked Mrs. Grant for the ham and stepped back out into the rain. He had no forensics, no DNA, and no search warrants. But he had the word of the postmistress and the ears of a hotelier. In Lochdubh, that was more than enough to start building a gallows. As he walked toward the hotel's main entrance, Hamish felt the familiar weight of the mystery. It wasn't about the vibe or the wellness. It was about the oldest motive in the world: greed. And Serena Vane, with her legal papers and her cold smile, was right at the heart of it. But first, he had to survive another encounter with Blair. He adjusted his cap, let his shoulders slump into his lazy posture, and prepared to look like a man who was only interested in where his next cup of tea was coming from. Chapter 5. The lady in room 4, Hamish Macbeth, was halfway up the plushly carpeted stairs of the Tummel Castle Hotel when a voice, as cool and clear as a mountain spring, stopped him in his tracks. "Hamish, are you here to rescue us from the boredom, or is this official business?" Hamish turned, his heart giving a small, traitorous leap. Standing in the doorway of the residence lounge was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was the daughter of the local gentry, a woman of such effortless grace and refined beauty that Hamish often felt like a giant, clumsy ginger oaf in her presence. Today she wore a pale cashmere sweater and charcoal trousers that made her look like she had stepped out of a high-end country life magazine. "Priscilla," Hamish said, removing his cap and clutching it against his chest. "I didn't know you were back from London. I arrived yesterday. My father is hosting a dinner for some investors, and I am playing the dutiful daughter," she said, stepping toward him. Her eyes, a sharp and intelligent blue, flicked to the upstairs landing. "I assume you're here about the tragedy at the Macrae estate. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive." Hamish sighed. "DCI Blair is convinced it's Archie MacLean, but I've a feeling the truth is a bit more expensive. You wouldn't happen to know anything about Julian Vane, would you? He seems like the sort of man who would have crossed paths with your father's circle." Priscilla leaned against the banister, her expression turning thoughtful. "Julian Vane was what my father calls a professional predator. He didn't build things, Hamish, he bought them, stripped them of their value, and sold the remains. The Highland sanctuary was a desperate gamble. I heard in London that he was nearly bankrupt. He needed a massive influx of cash to keep his creditors from the door. And what about a cousin? A Serena Vane?" Priscilla's lip curled in a way that was almost, but not quite, a sneer. "Serena isn't his cousin, Hamish. She was his business partner, and briefly his fiancée. They had a spectacular falling out last year over a development in Chelsea. She's a woman who views life as a series of hostile takeovers. If she's here, she isn't here to mourn. She's here to collect." "She's claiming to be his cousin to the police," Hamish noted, his eyes narrowing. "Of course she is," Priscilla said softly. "It makes her status as next of kin much cleaner. In the upper circles of London, Hamish, people like Serena use family trees the way a burglar uses a crowbar get into places they don't belong." Hamish nodded, taking in the information. Priscilla's insight into the social gymnastics of the wealthy was always more useful than any fingerprint kit. And would a woman like that be seen in red stilettos in a peat bog? Priscilla laughed, a short, melodic sound. Only if she intended to kill someone or if she was incredibly angry. Serena Vane wouldn't ruin a pair of Louboutins for a casual stroll. If she went to that gate, she went there with a purpose. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice warming. "Oh, you've given me more to chew on than a plate of Mrs. Grant's tough mutton." "Be careful, Hamish," she warned, her hand briefly touching his arm. "DCI Blair is looking for a quick win, and Serena Vane is looking for a fortune. Neither of them will appreciate you standing in their way." Hamish watched her return to the lounge before continuing his ascent to room 4. He felt a familiar eighth knowledge that no matter how many cases he solved, the distance between a village constable and the daughter of a baronet was wider than the Minch. He reached the door of room 4 and knocked, his posture sagging back into the lazy Bobby routine. "Come in," a sharp voice snapped. Hamish entered. The room was a whirlwind of silk scarves, expensive luggage, and the scent of a perfume that smelled like it was made from the crushed dreams of orchids. Serena Vane was seated at a small writing desk, a laptop open and several legal folders spread before her. She was strikingly beautiful in a hard, polished way, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes that looked like they were made of green glass. She was currently wearing a sensible pair of riding boots and a tweed skirt, but Hamish's eyes immediately went to the open suitcase on the luggage rack. Tucked into a side pocket was a flash of crimson heel of a red shoe. "Officer, Macbeth isn't it?" she said, not looking up from her screen. "I've already spoken to the angry little man in the grey suit. I have nothing more to say about my cousin's tragic accident. DCI Blair, Hamish said, twisting his cap in his hands. "A very thorough man, the inspector. He's quite sure it was a local poacher. I am just here for the Administrative sighed. The boring bits ye ken. Ah, Serena finally looked at him, her gaze scanning him with a mixture of boredom and contempt. And what boring bits could possibly require your presence? Just checking on the car, Mum. The Land Rover. Well be needing the keys to move it to the station for safekeeping. Wouldn't want the locals stripping the gold leaf off it, would we? Serena sighed and reached into her handbag, tossing a key fob onto the bed. Take it. I never liked that gaudy thing anyway. Julian had the taste of a lottery winner. Aye, it's a flashy yin, Hamish agreed, moving toward the bed to retrieve the keys. As he did, he clumsily brushed against the open suitcase. Oh, pardon me, Mum. "I'm a bit of a gawk," he apologised, his eyes darting to the red shoes. They were caked in mud. Not just any mud, but the thick, black, oily peat that was unique to the area around the Crofter's gate. More importantly, the mud was still damp. "Don't touch my things," Serena snapped, standing up with a hiss. "Terribly sorry, Mum." "My dog lugs, he says I'm all thumbs," Hamish said, backing away with a sheepish grin. "He'll just take these keys and be out of your way. I'm sure Ya'll be wanting to get back to your grieving." "Quite," she said, already turning back to her laptop. Hamish exited the room and closed the door softly behind him. His heart was hammering. He had seen enough. Serena Vane had been at the gate. She had been wearing those red shoes, and she had been there recently enough that the mud hadn't dried in the heated hotel room. But why would a woman who hated Julian Vane and his gaudy tastes follow him to a rusted gate in the rain? And why was she lying about being his cousin? He walked down the stairs, the Land Rover keys heavy in his pocket. Blair was currently at the station, likely trying to bully a confession out of Archie McLean. Hamish knew he couldn't go to Blair not yet. Blair would just tell Serena that Hamish had been snooping, and the evidence would vanish into the loch. No, Hamish needed to know what Julian Vane had been doing at that gate. And he needed to know what was in the folders Serena was so desperate to protect. He stepped out into the drizzling evening, whistling for Lugs. "Well, Lugs," he whispered as the dog trotted to his side. "The lady in room 4 is a liar, and Priscilla says the dead man was a crook. I'm thinking the Highland sanctuary was less about wellness and more about a very messy divorce of interests." He looked toward the police station. It was time for a bit more mooching, but this time, he'd be mooching for a look at Julian Vane's golden monstrosity. Chapter 6. The Red Shoe and the Wrong Man. The Lochdubh police station was a small, functional building that usually smelled of damp wool and Hamish's infinitely stewing coffee. Tonight, however, it reeked of stale cigarettes and the aggressive, misplaced masculinity of DCI Blair. Through the frosted glass of the interview room door, Hamish could hear the rhythmic pounding of a fist on a table. "Come on, McLean." "We found your scales in the heather. We know you were there." Blair's voice rose to a jagged crescendo. "You saw the rich Sassenach, you saw his fancy watch, and you decided to give him a Highland welcome. Just sign the statement, and we can all go home. I tell ye, Inspector," Archie's voice was thin and trembling. "I saw him, but he was already twisted in the iron. I didn't touch him. I ran for Hamish." Hamish stood in the main office, leaning against a filing cabinet with a look of vacant sympathy. Detectives Anderson and McLean were busy typing up reports, ignoring the drama in the next room with the practiced apathy of men who had seen Blair fail to break tougher nuts than Archie. "Poor soul," Hamish sighed, loud enough for Anderson to hear. "Archie's heart is as weak as a June frost. He'll likely have a stroke before he signs anything. Then there'll be an inquiry, and the papers in Strathbane do love a story about police brutality in the glens." Anderson paused his typing, a flicker of worry crossing his face. Blair's career was a series of narrow escapes from disciplinary hearings. "He's just doing his job, Macbeth. The man's a suspect." "I a suspect with no motive and less strength than a wet biscuit," Hamish murmured. "Bah! But he'll leave you to it. I've the keys to the deceased car. He'll just be cataloguing the contents for the inventory. It's a weary task, but someone has to do the donkey work." "Go ahead," Anderson grunted, relieved to have Hamish out of the way. "Just don't get orange hair all over the leather." Hamish stepped out into the night. The golden Land Rover sat in the station's small yard, looking like a fallen star in a coal shed. He unlocked the door with the fob Serena had given him. The interior was a sanctuary of cream leather and walnut trim. It smelled of Vane's expensive cologne and something chemical and sharp. He began to search, not with the frantic energy of Blair's team, but with the slow, methodical touch of a man looking for a missing needle in a haystack. He checked the glove box, maps, high-protein snack bars, a gold Rolex, the center console, more snack bars, a burner phone, and the door pockets of the driver's seat that he found it. A small black leather notebook. Hamish pulled it out and flicked through the pages. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. But it wasn't for a wellness retreat. It was a list of names, dates, and figuresque large figures. Beside several names were notes like in arrears and call Marcus foreclose. He wasn't building a sanctuary, lugs, Hamish whispered to the dog, who was watching from the pavement. He was a lone shark for the gentry, a high society parasite. Then he found the entry for the previous day. S4:00 p.m. Gate. Bring the original deed. No more games. S for Serena. Hamish tucked the notebook into his tunic. He then moved to the back of the vehicle. In the trunk, tucked into a hidden compartment near the spare tire, he found a pair of men's hiking boots. They were clean, but the tread was clogged with a very specific type of white clay. Hamish mind word. There was no white clay at the Crofter's gate. The gate sat on black peat and grey granite. But there was white clay at the old brickworks 3 miles down the coaster place where the local youth went to drink cider and the occasional runaway went to hide. He stood up, locking the car. He had the what, the ledger, and the who Serena, but he was missing the how and the why of the gate itself. Why kill a man in such a theatrical, humiliating way? As he walked back toward the station, he saw Blair stomping out of the front door, his face a vivid shade of magenta. Useless! Blair screamed at the sky. The old fool fainted. I've had to call the village nurse. This is your fault, Macbeth. Your village is populated by cowards and weaklings. Terribly sorry, sir, Hamish said, looking down at his boots. I've finished the inventory. Nothing of interest. Just some maps and a gold watch. I've put the keys on your desk. A gold watch? At least that's something, Blair grumbled, shoving past him. I'm going to the hotel. I need a drink and a word with that cousin. Maybe she's got more backbone than the fisherman. I wouldn't be so sure, sir, Hamish called out after him. She seems a very delicate creature. Very fragile. Blair ignored him, climbing into his car and peeling out of the yard. Hamish watched the taillights disappear. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Blair would storm into Serena's room. She would play the grieving, insulted relative, and Blair, the sucker for a pretty woman with a posh accent, would end up apologizing and probably buying her a gin and tonic. But Hamish had the ledger, and he knew about the white clay. He walked to his own Land Rover and whistled for lugs. Come on, lad. We're going to the brickworks. I've a feeling Julian Vane wasn't the only one Serena was meeting at the gate, and I've a feeling Archie McLean wasn't the only one watching from the heather. As he drove, Hamish thought about the red shoes caked in mud. Serena had been at the gate, yes, but the ledger suggested Julian was the one in control. For a woman like Serena to take control back, she wouldn't just need a motive shed, need a partner. And Marcus Mann from the phone call was still a shadow in the mist. The heavy brigade can have the hotel bar, Hamish muttered, the wipers of his car slapping a rhythmic beat against the rain. Well, take the cold mud and the truth. Chapter 7. The shadow of Marcus the old brickworks sat on a desolate stretch of coastline where the Atlantic chewed relentlessly at the cliffs. It was a skeletal ruin of soot-stained chimneys and crumbling kilns, a monument to an industry that had died out before Hamish was born. As the Land Rover lurched down the rutted track, the headlamps cut through the thickening soft weather, reflecting off pools of chalky white slurry. Stay, lugs, Hamish commanded as he stepped out. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl, his hackles rising. Lugs didn't like the brickworks. It smelled of salt, decay, and things that had been dead for a very long time. Hamish pulled a heavy torch from his belt and clicked it on. The beam danced across the white clay. There, as clear as a signature, were the tracks of a vehiculoid, deep-treaded tyres that didn't match the elegant golden Land Rover or the local tractors. Beside them were the prints of a man's heavy boots. The same boots Hamish had seen in the hidden compartment of Julian Vane's car. So, Julian was here, Hamish whispered, his breath ghosting in the cold air. But who was he meeting in a place that hasn't seen a soul since the 60s? He followed the prints toward the largest of the kilns. Inside, the air was still and smelled of ancient smoke. In the center of the floor, the white clay was scuffed and disturbed. Hamish knelt, his torch beam settling on a small rectangular patch of ground that had been swept clean. He reached out and brushed a finger against the grit. Tucked into a crack in the brickwork was a small, torn piece of paper. It was a corner of a bank draft kind used for international transfer sand. The fragment remaining bore a partial name. Ericus Torn. Marcus, Hamish breathed. He remembered Priscilla's description of Julian, a professional predator who was nearly bankrupt.
Oh. If Julian was a lone shark, perhaps Marcus Thorne was his enforcer or his financier.
Or perhaps, as Serena's phone call suggested, Marcus was the one waiting in the wings to inherit the spoils of Julian's hostile takeovers. Hamish stood up, his mind weaving the threads together. Julian Vane had come to Lochdubh not to build a sanctuary, but to hide from a debt or to squeeze a final payment from someone. He had met Marcus here, at the brickworks, to exchange the original deed mentioned in the ledger. But why the gate? Why the bizarre, theatrical death? He walked back out into the rain, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, the lights of Lochdubh twinkled through the mist, looking small and fragile against the brooding mountains. Suddenly, the sound of a high-powered engine drifted over the cliffs. It wasn't the roar of Blair's car or the hum of the golden Land Rover. It was a low, predatory growl. Hamish doused his torch. He stood in the shadows of the kiln, his hand resting on Lug's head to keep the dog quiet. A dark grey Jaguar, its lights extinguished, rolled slowly down the track. It stopped 50 yards away. A man stepped out. Even in the gloom, Hamish could tell he was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a military precision that suggested he didn't care for the lazy pace of the Highlands. The man walked toward the kiln, his boots crunching in the white clay. He reached the entrance and paused, his silhouette framed against the grey sky. He pulled a mobile phone from his pocket, the screen illuminating a face that was all sharp angles and cold, dark eyes. "I am at the site," the man said, his voice a low baritone that carried clearly in the still air. No sign of the ledger. Vane must have hidden it before he got himself caught. There was a pause as he listened to the person on the other end. "I don't care about the woman, Serena," the man snapped. "She's a liability. If she can't find that book, she's of no use to me. And tell her to stop wearing those damned red shoes. She's leaving a trail even a village idiot could follow." Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a business partner, he was the architect. And Serena was his scouter-scout who was currently failing her mission. "I'll check the gate again," Marcus continued. "Maybe he dropped it in the heather when I assisted him. If the local law finds it, we have a problem. That red-headed policeman looks like a fool, but he's been hanging around the hotel like a bad smell." The man ended the call and turned back toward his car. Hamish stayed frozen in the shadows until the Jaguar had turned around and disappeared back toward the main road. "Well now," Hamish said, letting out a long, shaky breath. "It seems I've been promoted from village idiot to bad smell. That's progress, I suppose." He looked down at Lugs. "Did you hear that, lad?" Assisted him. "Marcus Thorne didn't just find Julian at the gate. He put him there. He held him while the iron did the work. A man like that wouldn't leave a ledger behind unless he had to flee the scene in a hurry." The ledger was currently tucked safely inside Hamish's tunic, but Marcus didn't know that. Marcus thought it was still out there, lost in the damp Highland soil. Hamish felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind he usually only felt when he was outwitting a particularly clever salmon. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't go to Blair. Blair would likely try to arrest Marcus Thorne for speeding and lose the whole case in a flurry of London lawyers and procedural errors. No, Hamish needed to set a trap. He needed Marcus and Serena to come to him. He climbed back into his Land Rover, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. If they are looking for a trail even an idiot could follow, Lugs, then we'd best start laying one. But we'll need some help. We'll need a bit of village gossip and a very specific piece of lost property. As he drove back toward Lochdubh, Hamish wasn't thinking about his supper anymore. He was thinking about the Crofter's gate and how it was about to catch a much larger predator than Julian Vane.
Chapter 8. The rumour mill in the Highlands. News travels faster than a gale-force wind and with considerably more bite. By the following morning, the village of Lochdubh was a swirling vortex of speculation. Hamish Macbeth, looking particularly dishevelled and leaning heavily on his bicycle, was at the centre of the storm, moving from the docks to the grocery, with the practised air of a man who had a very heavy secret he was just dying to drop. He stopped at the curb outside the Tummel Castle Hotel, where he knew the staff would be listening and the cousin in room 4 would likely be lurking behind her curtains. "It's a pity," Hamish said to Willie Lamont, the village's part-time handyman and full-time gossip, loud enough for the sound to carry up to the open windows of the first floor. "DCI Blair is convinced it's poor Archie, but I found a wee black book near the gate this morning. Tucked right into the hollow of a stone it was." Willie, who had been briefed by Hamish 10 minutes earlier over a dram of illicit whiskey,
widened his eyes with theatrical flair. A black book, Hamish? Whatever would be in that? Names, Willie. Names and numbers. And a very large bank draft made out to a man named Marcus. Hamish sighed, shaking his head. I've hidden it for safekeeping until the superintendent arrives from Inverness tomorrow morning. I didn't want Blair losing it in all his excitement. And where would a man hide such a thing? Willie asked, leaning in. In the old police lock-up at the end of the pier, Hamish whispered, though his whisper was of the stage variety, the one with the rusted door. No one goes there, and I've the only key. He'll be taking it to the big brass at dawn. Hamish tipped his cap and cycled away, feeling the prickle of eyes on his back. He knew that Serena Vane would be on her phone within minutes. And he knew that Marcus Thorne, a man who dealt in hostile takeovers and assisting people into iron gates, wouldn't be able to resist a direct threat to his freedom. By 10 o'clock that night, the rain had returned, a steady rhythmic drumming against the stones of the harbour. Lochdubh was tucked away, its inhabitants retreated behind glowing windows and peat fires. Hamish sat in the darkness of the old stone lock-up on the pier, the smell of salt spray and ancient fish scales heavy in the air. He wasn't alone. Lugs was curled at his feet, his ears twitching at every creak of the timber pilings. "Patience, lad," Hamish murmured. "Greed is a hungry beast. Doesn't like to wait for the morning." An hour passed. The only sound was the slop of the tide against the pier. Then the faint metallic clink of a boat's hull bumping against the wood. Hamish didn't move. He watched through a crack in the door as two figures emerged from the gloom. One was tall and moved with the silent, predatory grace of Marcus Thorne. The other, stumbling slightly on the uneven boards, was Serena Vane. She was no longer wearing her red shoes. She had opted for a dark jumpsuit and trainers, looking like a high-fashion burglar. "I told you he was a fool," Serena hissed, her voice tight with nerves. He practically broadcasted the location to the whole village. Why didn't he just leave it at the station? Because he's a provincial non-entity trying to play hero. Marcus' voice was like grinding gravel. He wants the glory of handing it to the superintendent. He doesn't realize that in this world, heroes disappear into the loch without a trace. Marcus reached the door of the lock-up. He didn't bother with a key. He produced a short crowbar and wedged it into the frame. With a sickening groan of protesting wood, the door gave way. They stepped into the black interior. Marcus clicked on a high-powered tactical torch, the beam cutting through the dust like a laser. It landed on a small wooden table in the center of the room. On top of the table sat a black notebook. "There," Serena gasped, reaching for it. "Get it, Marcus. We need to burn it before we leave tonight." "Wait," Marcus said, his hand catching her arm. He panned the light around the room. "Where is the policeman?" "Right behind the door, Mr. Thorne," Hamish said softly. He stepped out of the shadows, his own torch clicking on. But he didn't hold a gun. Hamish didn't care for them. Instead, he held a heavy, iron-weighted salmon gaff, the kind used for pulling massive fish from the water. Marcus Thorne didn't panic. He slowly reached into his jacket, his eyes fixed on Hamish with a cold, murderous intensity. "You should have stayed in your kitchen, Macbeth. You're a long way from a cup of tea." "And you're a long way from London, sir," Hamish replied, his voice steady. "In Lochdubh, we don't much like people who come here to assist our gates into doing their killing for them. I am thinking you found Julian a bit of a burden once the money ran dry." "Julian was a parasite," Marcus said, his hand emerging from his coat holding a silenced pistol. "He was going to sell the ledger to the authorities to buy his own immunity. I simply ensured the transaction was cancelled." Serena backed away, her face pale in the torchlight. "Marcus, just take the book and let's go. We don't need another body." "Oh," Serena, Marcus said, not taking his eyes off Hamish. "We do. A village policeman who died in a tragic accident on a slippery pier. It fits the narrative perfectly." Hamish felt the cold bite of fear, but he also felt the familiar, sharp clarity that came when the stakes were highest. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at Lugs. "Now, Lugs," Hamish barked. The dog didn't growl, he didn't bark. He launched himself from the shadows like a hairy cannonball, aimed straight for Marcus Thorne's legs. At the same moment, Hamish swung the heavy gaff, not at Marcus, but at the overhead paraffin lamp he had pre-loosened from the ceiling. The lamp shattered, spraying burning oil across the floor and plunging the room into a chaotic strobe of orange flame and thick, black smoke. A shot rang out, a muffled thud, but Marcus was already off balance as Lug's 60 pounds of muscle and fur slammed into his knees. The bullet went wide, shattering a window. Hamish didn't wait. He moved with a speed that would have shocked DCI Blair, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He swung the wooden handle of the gaff, catching Marcus squarely across the wrist. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding toward the growing pool of fire. "Serena, help me," Marcus roared, struggling with the dog. But Serena Vane had already turned and fled into the night, her loyalty to Marcus proving to be as shallow as her grief for Julian. Hamish pinned Marcus against the stone wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. Despite the flames and the smoke, Hamish's face was almost bored. "You're a big man in a city, Mr. Thorne," Hamish whispered into his ear. "But here, you're just another catch that's too small to keep. I am thinking the Scottish prisons are very exclusive this time of year." Outside, the sound of sirens began to wail real ones this time. Hamish had made sure the village nurse, who was also the wife of the local coastguard, knew exactly when to call for backup. As the door was kicked open by a frantic, soot-covered Detective Anderson, Hamish stepped back, wiping a smudge of ash from his forehead. He looked at the chaos, the fire, and the groaning man on the floor.
Ah.
"Anderson," Hamish said, his Highland burr returning to its usual lazy lilt. "You're just in time. I think Mr. Thorne here has been trying to set fire to police property. A very serious offence. I am sure DCI Blair will agree." Chapter 9. The credit shift the morning following the fire at the harbour lockup was one of those rare crystalline Highland days where the air is so sharp it feels like drinking chilled wine. The mist had finally retreated to the highest peaks of Ben Buoy, leaving Lochdubh sparkling under a pale, triumphant sun. Inside the police station, however, the atmosphere was considerably more clouded. DCI Blair sat at Hamish's desk, his face a complex map of soot stains, exhaustion, and burgeoning ambition. He was staring at the black ledger and the confession that Marcus Thornunda the Relentless. Joyless questioning of the Strathbane team had finally coughed up once he realised Serena Vane had already tried to cut a deal with the coastguard in Ullapool. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window, petting lugs and looking particularly gormless. He had a small bandage on his forehead and his uniform was scorched at the cuffs, but he wore an expression of mild, bovine confusion. "So, let me get this straight, Macbeth," Blair growled, tapping a stubby finger on the ledger. "Oh, you're telling me that you didn't actually find this book by the gate. You just... Guess where it was?" No, sir," Hamish said, widening his eyes. "I found it under the seat of the golden car when I was doing that inventory you told me to do. I thought I mentioned it, but with all the shouting and the poor fisherman fainting, I must have gotten muddled. I am a very muddled man, as you've often observed." Blair's eyes narrowed. He knew Hamish was lying. He knew that Hamish had orchestrated a village-wide rumour, lured a professional killer into a trap, and essentially solved the most high-profile murder in the county, while Blair was busy bullying a man who spent his life talking to salmon. But Blair also knew that the superintendent was on his way from Inverness. A success of this magnitude bringing down a London-based extortion ring and solving a bizarre homicide-mined medals, commendations, and a direct path to a comfortable desk job in Edinburgh. "The superintendent will be here in 20 minutes, Macbeth," Blair said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "He's going to want a full briefing on how we cracked this case. He'll want to know who led the operation." Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who found the very idea of a briefing to be a form of torture. "It's a terrible lot of paperwork, sir. And the interviews, the television cameras, the being moved to a big, noisy city office where there's no fishing and the coffee tastes like burnt rubber." Hamish looked out the window at the loch. "I'm thinking a man like me would only get in the way of a brilliant detective like yourself, Inspector. I'd likely trip over my own tongue and embarrass the whole force. If you were to tell the superintendent that you directed the entire stink that I was just following your very specific, very clever orders well, that would be the truth of the hierarchy, wouldn't it?" Blair puffed out his chest, the soot on his lapel fluttering. "It was my investigation, Macbeth. I was the one who identified Vane as a person of interest immediately. My pressure on the fisherman clearly flushed the real killers out of hiding." "Exactly, sir." Hamish nodded encouragingly. "It was a masterclass in heavy brigade tactics. I was just the bait, and everyone knows the bait doesn't get the trophy the fisherman does." Blair stood up, smoothing his rumpled suit and adjusting his tie with a sudden renewed vigour. "You're a lazy, incompetent, red-headed nuisance, Macbeth, but at least you know your place. I'll make sure your name is mentioned in the footnotes. PC Macbeth assisted with scene security, or something of the sort." "That would be more than enough, sir," Hamish said, a small secret smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I wouldn't want to be promoted. I've a pot of stew on the stove and a dog that doesn't care for the city." The sound of a heavy car pulling into the yard signalled the arrival of the superintendent. Blair checked his reflection in the glass of a filing cabinet, wiped a smudge of ash from his nose, and marched out to the front office with the stride of a conquering hero. Hamish watched through the window as the big brass from Inverness stepped out, looking impressed by the sheer volume of evidence and the high-profile prisoner being loaded into a transport van. Blair began to speak, gesturing wildly toward the harbour and then toward himself, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had single-handedly wrestled a shark. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered, scratching the dog behind his hairy ears. "He's bought it. Hook, line, and sinker." Detective Anderson walked past, pausing for a moment to look at Hamish. Anderson was a cynical man, but he wasn't a fool. He looked at the scorched lock-up on the pier, then at the ledger, and finally at Hamish's placid face. "You're a piece of work, Macbeth," Anderson said quietly. "Blair's going to get a Queen's Police Medal for this, and you're going to get a reprimand for a damaged paraffin lamp." "Aye," Hamish said, his gaze fixed on a distant heron gliding over the water. "But Blair will be in Edinburgh, sitting in meetings about budgets and traffic flow, and he'll be right here, watching the sun go down over the loch. Him thinking I've got the better end of the bargain." Anderson shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his face, and followed his boss. The station slowly emptied as the heavy brigade prepared to escort their prize back to Strathbane. The sirens, once so intrusive and loud, faded into the distance until the only sound left was the gentle lapping of the tide and the distant cry of a gull. Hamish reached for his cap and put it on, tilting it back at a jaunty angle. The case was closed. The Highland sanctuary had been exposed as a den of thieves, and the peace of Lochdubh briefly disturbed by fire and folly had been restored. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, heading for the door. "Let's go see if Mrs. Grant has any of those scones left. I am thinking a hero's welcome is all well and good, but a policeman's breakfast is a much more pressing concern." Chapter 10. The quiet return the morning after the Strathbane CID had roared out of Lochdubh, taking with them their sirens, their soot-stained suits, and a very indignant Marcus Thorneth village settled back into its ancient rhythmic heartbeat. The sun had decided to linger, casting a golden hue over the heather that made the previous night's fire at the lockup seem like a half-forgotten bad dream. Hamish Macbeth was back at his kitchen table in the police station, the air no longer smelling of DCI Blair's cheap cigarettes, but of something far more restorative: strong, black coffee, and the savoury, earthy scent of a slow-simmering mutton stew. Lugs lay stretched out across the threshold, his chin resting on his paws, his eyes tracking a single lazy bumblebee that had wandered in through the open door. The dog looked satisfied, as if he knew that his contribution to the Arresta 60-pound flying tack lures the real reason the big brass had anything to celebrate. There was a light tap at the door, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped inside. She looked as fresh as a spring morning in a crisp white blouse and a navy skirt, carrying a small wicker basket. "I brought you some of the cook's bramble jam and a loaf of honey bread," she said, placing the basket on the table. She looked around the quiet kitchen, her blue eyes sparkling with amusement. "I hear the hero of the hour is currently halfway to Edinburgh to receive a commendation." "Aye," Hamish said, rising to pull out a chair for her. DCI Blair was very keen to get to the city. He said the intellectual vacuum of the Highlands was starting to affect his blood pressure. "I am thinking the thin air of the Pentland Hills will suit his ego much better." Priscilla sat down, her gaze lingering on the small bandage on Hamish's forehead. "And what about the man who actually found the ledger? The man who lured a professional hitman into a burning shed? What does he get?" Hamish poured her a cup of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. "He gets to stay right here, Priscilla. He gets to walk the hills without someone shouting about procedure or jurisdiction. He gets to fish the Angana when the salmon are running, and he gets to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee with a beautiful woman." Priscilla smiled, a soft, genuine expression that always made Hamish's heart feel a size too large for his chest. "You're a rogue, Hamish Macbeth. You let that man take all the credit just so you could avoid a promotion. Promotion is just a fancy word for more paperwork and less fresh air," Hamish replied, leaning back against the counter. "Besides, if I were a detective inspector in Glasgow who would keep an eye on the poachers in Lochdubh, they'd be decimated without a policeman who knows exactly which nights to stay in by the fire." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that only exists between people who understand the unsaid things. "The Macrae estate is back on the market, you know," Priscilla said eventually. "Serena Vane's lawyers are trying to liquidate the assets to pay for her defence. My father thinks a local trust might buy it to keep it as grazing land. No more Highland sanctuaries." "That's grand news," Hamish muttered. "The sheep will be much better guests." They don't complain about the vibe and they never wear red stilettos. After Priscilla left, promising to see him at the Highland Games next month, Hamish returned to his stew. Oh! He stirred the pot, the steam fogging his spectacles. He felt a profound sense of peace. The gold-plated Sassenach was gone, the heavy brigade had retreated, and the Crofter's gate was once again just a rusted piece of iron, marking the boundary of a quiet hill. He thought briefly of Julian Vane. The man had come to the Highlands looking for a sanctuary from his own greed, only to find that the mountains have a way of reflecting a person's true nature back at them. Vane had been cold and rigid, and he had died in a cold, rigid embrace. Hamish reached for a bowl and ladled out a generous portion of the stew. He sat down at the table, Lugs immediately sitting up and resting a hopeful chin on his knee. You hairy beggar, Hamish grumbled affectionately, dropping a succulent piece of mutton into the dog's waiting mouth. The village of Lochdubh was quiet. Outside, the waters of the loch were a deep sapphire blue, roughened only by the occasional leap of a trout. To the world outside the glens, Hamish Macbeth was a lazy, unremarkable village bobby who had assisted in a major case. But to the folk of Lochdubh, and to the mountains that watched over them, he was something else entirely. He was the man who listened to the silence. He was the man who knew that justice didn't always come in a courtroom, but sometimes arrived in the creak of a gate or the shadow of a kiln. Hamish took a sip of his coffee and sighed with contentment. He was home. He was safe. And most importantly of all, he was still just a humble PC with no one to answer to but the wind and his own conscience. As the sun began its long, slow descent toward the Atlantic, casting long shadows across the pier, Hamish Macbeth finished his supper, put his feet up on the fender, and closed his eyes. The mystery was solved, the belly was full, and tomorrow he might just go and see if that big silver salmon was still lingering in the pool by the Angama. After all, a man has to eat. Chapter 11. The solicitor and the silver lining the piece of Lochdubh was rarely absolute, it was usually a fragile thing, held together by the lack of cellular signal and the general reluctance of the population to move faster than a brisk walk. 2 days after the departure of the heavy brigade, a sleek black ordinate metallic gold, thankfully, but still far too clean for the Sutherland road spurred to a halt outside the police station. Hamish Macbeth was currently engaged in the delicate task of trying to repair a leaky fountain pen, a process that had resulted in more ink on his fingers than in the reservoir. Lugs was asleep in a patch of sunlight, his paws twitching as he chased imaginary rabbits across a dreamscape of gorse and heather. A man stepped out of the Audi. He was thin, wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been ironed with a ruler, and carried a briefcase with the sort of reverence usually reserved for the Holy Grail. He walked into the station, pausing to wrinkle his nose at the lingering scent of Hamish morning kippers. "Good morning," the man said, his voice clipped and precise. "I am Mr. Pringle of Pringle, Pringle, and Thistle. I am looking for the officer in charge of the Vane investigation. I was told a Detective Chief Inspector Blair was the lead, but I was directed here for the local particulars." Hamish looked up, his face adopting its most helpful, slightly vacant expression. He surreptitiously wiped an inky thumb on the underside of the desk. That would be me. Or rather, the particulars would be here. DCI Blair is back in the city enjoying his promotion and the central heating. Mr. Pringle sighed, a sound like air escaping a very expensive balloon. Typical. The glory moves to Edinburgh while the paperwork stays in the mud. I am here on behalf of the Macrae family, the actual Macrae family. Hamish paused, his blue eyes sharpening for a fraction of a second before softening back into a dull glaze. Dectwell family? I was under the impression Mr. Vane bought the estate lock, stock and barrel from a firm in London. He bought a leasehold, Mr. Macbeth, Pringle said, snapping open his briefcase. A leasehold that was contingent on the commencement of agricultural improvements. Mr. Vane, in his infinite arrogance, believed that wellness qualified as sheep farming. My clients, who reside in New Zealand and have been trying to reclaim the ancestral land for decades, have successfully argued in the High Court that the sale was fraudulent. Hamish leaned back, the old wooden chair creaking in protest. So, you're saying Mr. Vane didn't actually own the Crofter's gate? He didn't own a single blade of grass, Pringle confirmed, pulling out a sheaf of thick, cream-coloured documents. The deed he was so obsessed with, the one that Marcus Thorne was apparently willing to kill for, was a forgery Julian had created to secure loans from Thorne's investment firm. It was a house of cards, Constable, a very expensive, very bloody house of cards. Hamish felt a sudden sharp urge to laugh, but he suppressed it, settling for a slow, thoughtful nod. The irony was as thick as a Lochdubh fog. Julian Vane had died for a piece of paper that wasn't worth the ink it was printed on, and Marcus Thorne had ruined his life for a debt that could never be collected. And what happens to the estate now? Hamish asked. It reverts to the Macquarie Trust. They intend to turn it into a community grazing project. No retreats, no gold Land Rovers, and certainly no exclusive gates. They've even requested that the ironwork be removed and replaced with a standard timber gate that actually opens. That'll be a mercy, Hamish murmured. The village will be glad of it. It's hard to have a sanctuary when the gate is trying to throttle the guests. Mr. Pringle finished his business with the efficiency of a man who charged by the minute. He left behind a stack of forms and a sense of cold, legal finality. As the black Audi sped away, Hamish walked to the window and watched the dust settle on the road. "Do you hear that, Lugs?" Hamish said, the dog opening one eye. It was all for nothing. The big city crooks came up here to play at being lords of the manor, and they didn't even have the right papers. He felt a tap at the back door. It was Mr. Patel, the owner of the local curry shop, carrying a plastic container that radiated a spicy aromatic heat. "A bit of vegetable korma, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, stepping in. "My wife says you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal since the fire, and we heard the news the Sassenach lawyers are gone." "They are indeed, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, accepting the container with a grateful smile. "The land is going back to the folk who know what to do with it." "Good," Mr. Patel beamed. "I was worried I'd have to start serving kale smoothies to tourists in white robes. I don't think my stove knows how to cook kale. It has a sense of pride, you see." Hamish sat back down at his desk, the warm korma a far better companion than the ink-stained pen. Oh, he thought about Blair, sitting in his new office, probably boasting about the Vane estate sting. Blair wouldn't care that the motive for the murder was a lie. Blair only cared about the arrest. But Hamish cared. He cared because it proved what he had always suspected, that the world of high finance and exclusive wellness was often far more crooked and desperate than a Highland poacher looking for a salmon. He looked at the bandage on his forehead in the small, cracked mirror by the door. It was a small price to pay for the return of the quiet. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, dipping a piece of naan into the sauce. "The gate is coming down, the lawyers are away, and we've got a hot lunch. I'm thinking the Highland sanctuary has finally arrived and it didn't cost a penny." He spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what he did best, sitting quietly, eating well, and watching the clouds roll over the peaks, perfectly content to be exactly where he was, with no desire to be anywhere else. Chapter 12, The Salmon's Revenge, the Cycle of Life in Lochdubh, had a way of smoothing over even the jagged edges of a murder investigation. Within a week, the Highland sanctuary signs had been torn down by a particularly fierce north wind, and the golden Land Rover had been towed away to a police impound lot in Strathbane, looking oddly small and tawdry under the vast indifferent sky. PC Hamish Macbeth was back where he had started, crouched behind the gorse bushes on the banks of the river Ngana. The morning was Dryker fine, soaking mist that turned his ginger hair into a damp sponge butt to Hamish. It was perfect. There were no sirens, no London solicitors, and, most importantly, no DCI Blair. Lugg sat beside him, his ears alert. They were both staring at the same dark pool where the silver salmon had mocked them on the morning Julian Vane had arrived. "Today's the day." "Lugs," Hamish whispered. "The water's high, the light is low, and that fish has had a week to get overconfident." He cast his line with the grace of a man who had spent more time studying the currents of the river than the statutes of the criminal code. The fly danced across the surface, a tiny speck of colour against the peat-stained water. Suddenly the surface erupted. The rod bent into a dramatic arc, the reel singing a high, metallic song. "I have him," Hamish cried, his eyes alight with a predatory joy that never touched them during a murder inquiry. For 20 minutes it was a battle of wills. The salmon was a fighter, a 20-pound bolt of silver lightning that knew every submerged root and jagged rock in the Ngana. Hamish played the line with expert patience, slowly coaxing the beast toward the shallow bank. Just as he was about to reach for his net, a familiar braying voice echoed across the glen. "Macbeth, is that you ginger-headed layabout?" Hamish's heart sank faster than a lead weight. He looked up to see a dark blue sedan parked on the road above. Stepping out was a man in a sharp suit, not Blair, but Detective Inspector Anderson, looking uncharacteristically cheerful. The momentary distraction was all the salmon needed. With one final magnificent leap that seemed to thumb its nose at the entire Scottish police authority, the fish spat the hook, and vanished into the depths with a contemptuous slap of its tail. Hamish stood frozen, holding a limp line. He let out a long, shuddering sigh and turned to face Anderson. He was a grand yin inspector, nearly a record breaker. Anderson scrambled down the bank, avoiding the mud with considerably more skill than his predecessor. "Forget the fish, Hamish. Have you seen the morning papers?" He held out a copy of the Strathbane Gazette. There, on the front page, was a photograph of DCI Blair. He was standing outside the Scottish Parliament, looking remarkably like a prize-winning toad, his chest puffed out so far that his waistcoat buttons were under visible strain. The headline read, "Hero Detective Smashes London Extortion Ring. Blair Promoted to Chief Superintendent." "Chief Superintendent," Hamish repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Well, I suppose the higher he climbs, the more folk there are in Edinburgh to catch the brunt of his temper." "He's gone, Hamish," Anderson said, a note of genuine relief in his voice. "Transferred this morning. He spent his final hour in the office writing a memo about the incompetence of rural policing, but he was smiling the whole time he wrote it. He thinks he's the King of Scotland." "And the woman?" "Serena Vane?" "She's talking like a radio with a stuck dial," Anderson replied. "Turns out she was the one who forged the deeds, but she's pinning the actual murder on Marcus Thorne. Thorne is staying silent, but with the ledger you found, he's going away for a very long time. The Macrae estate is officially back with the local trust as of an hour ago." Hamish nodded, reeling in his empty line. "It's a good result, then." "It's a brilliant result," Anderson said, looking at Hamish with a curious, searching expression. "The superintendent wanted me to ask you something, off the record. He wants to know how a village bobby managed to find a hidden ledger in a car that 3 of my best detectives had already searched twice." Hamish adopted his most vacant, wide-eyed look. "Och, well, you know how it is, Inspector. I'm a tall man, and I've got long arms. I was just reaching for a dropped peppermint when my fingers brushed against the leather. It was pure luck, really. I'm a very lucky man." Anderson stared at him for a long beat. He knew Hamish was a liar. He knew that Hamish Macbeth was perhaps the most dangerous man in the Highlands, not because he was violent, but because he was invisible. "Right," Anderson said slowly. "Pure luck. Well, he'll leave you to your luck, Hamish. I've got to get back to Strathbane. Without Blair, there's actually a chance we might get some real work done." As the detective's car disappeared back toward the main road, Hamish sat down on a mossy stone. Luggs came over and rested his head on Hamish's knee, offering a low, sympathetic whine for the lost salmon. "Don't you worry, Luggs," Hamish murmured, ruffling the dog's ears. "The fish will be there tomorrow, and so will we." He looked at the newspaper again, at Blair's smug, triumphant face. He felt no bitterness. Blair had his promotion, his city office, and his shiny new title. In exchange, Hamish had his freedom. He had the smell of the damp earth, the sound of the river, and the knowledge that the Highlands sanctuary was once again just a place where a man could be left alone. The murder at the Crofter's gate would soon become just another story told over a dram at the Tommel Castle Hotel, a bit of village lore to be chewed over by Mrs. Kennedy and Willie Lamont. And Hamish would be there, listening, nodding, and looking like a man who couldn't solve a crossword puzzle, let alone a capital crime. He stood up, slung his rod over his shoulder, and began the long walk back to the police station. Oh, he could already smell the peat smoke from the village chimneys. Tonight he would have a pot of tea, a bowl of stew, and perhaps a small glass of whiskey to celebrate his continued incompetence. The Highlands were a place of deep shadows and long memories, but for now, the sun was trying to peek through the clouds. Hamish Macbeth, the laziest and smartest man in Sutherland, whistled a low, mournful tune as he disappeared into the mist, a ginger ghost in a world that never quite realized he was watching.